A retired police officer sat alone in the frozen silence of the mountains, clutching a silver badge that felt more like a tombstone. He thought he had nothing left to save, until a desperate scratching at his door broke the silence. When he opened it, he didn't just find a dog. He found a mother, German shepherd, caked in ice and bleeding, with a tiny, frozen puppy hanging from her jaws. She dropped the pup at his feet and disappeared back into the deathly blizzard, returning again and again. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Catskill Mountains were no longer a landscape. They had become a white void. In the small town of Willow Creek, New York, the record-breaking blizzard of 2026 had buried the world under 4 feet of relentless snow. The wind howled like a wounded predator, rattling the skeletal branches of frozen maples and suffocating the street lamps until the town felt like a ghost of its former self. Inside a secluded timber cabin at the edge of the forest, silence was the only occupant. Elias Thorne sat in the center of that silence. At 42, Elias was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very granite of the mountains he now called home. He was tall, with broad, heavy shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight even when he was sitting still. His hair, once a deep obsidian, was now prematurely peppered with salt at the temples. His face was a map of his former life, a sharp, disciplined jawline covered by a rugged, unkempt beard, and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, deep, piercing, but flickering with a hollow exhaustion. Elias had been a decorated patrol officer in the NYPD, known for his stoic bravery and a moral compass that never wavered. However, after the tragic loss of his partner, Benny, in a rain-slicked pursuit through the Bronx 2 years ago, that compass had shattered. He was a man of few words, choosing isolation over the pitying glances of his old precinct. He was haunted by the memory of a hand slipping through his fingers, a failure that had turned a once passionate protector into a ghost living in the woods. He sat by the dying embers of his hearth, staring at his old silver shield resting in the palm of his hand. The metal was cold. The numbers engraved on it felt like a tombstone. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the gale. It wasn't the wind, it was a rhythmic, desperate scratching against the heavy oak of his front door. Elias froze. His muscles, trained by decades of high-stakes policing, tensed, instinctively. He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet room, and moved toward the door. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the deadbolt, his heart thumping against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. When the door swung open, the blizzard lunged inside, coating the floorboards in a spray of ice. Elias squinted against the stinging white, and then he saw her. Luna, a German shepherd of magnificent but ravaged proportions, stood on his porch. Even caked in ice, her coat showed the classic saddle-black and tan markings of her breed. She was large for a female, with a deep chest and powerful limbs, though now she was dangerously thin, her ribs tracing faint lines beneath her wet fur. Her ears, usually regal and alert, were pressed back against her skull. Her eyes were her most striking feature, a brilliant, intelligent amber that held a haunting mixture of ancient maternal instinct and absolute, soul-crushing terror. Luna was roughly 5 years old, a dog in the prime of her life, but pushed to the very brink of survival. She was not a stray. There was a nobility in her stance that suggested she had once been someone's world. Elias gasped as his gaze dropped to her mouth. Luna was holding a bundle of fur. Gently, with a delicacy that defied the chaos of the storm, she stepped forward and placed the bundle at Elias's feet. It was a puppy, no more than a few weeks old, its fur a matted gray-blue from the cold. The tiny creature was motionless, its skin turning a terrifying shade of bruised purple. Elias looked up, his breath hitching. "Where did you come from, girl?" Luna didn't bark. She didn't whine. She looked Elias directly in the eyes, a silent plea passing between them that was louder than any siren he had ever heard. In that gaze, Elias saw the same desperation he had seen in Benny's eyes the night the world ended. Then he noticed the blood. Luna's left ear was jagged, a fresh tear weeping crimson onto the white snow. Her front right paw was lifted slightly, the pad sliced open by jagged ice or perhaps a hidden trap. The blood was bright, hot, and vanishing quickly under the falling flakes. Before Elias could reach out to her, Luna took a step back. She cast one long, lingering look at her shivering pup, then turned toward the black abyss of the forest. "Wait! No!" Elias shouted, stepping onto the porch. But the German shepherd was already a shadow. She vanished into the blizzard with a burst of speed that could only be fueled by pure adrenaline and a mother's love, heading back toward whatever hidden den held the rest of her heart. Elias stood there for a second, the wind whipping his face. The cold bit into his skin, but the sight of the blood on the snow bit deeper. It triggered a flash of the Bronx, the rain, the slick pavement, the feeling of being too late. Not this time, he thought, the old Elias Thorne suddenly snapping back into existence. "I'm not watching another life slip away." He scooped up the frozen puppy. It felt like a piece of ice. He rushed back inside, kicking the door shut. The cabin, once a place of stagnant mourning, became a precinct of survival. Elias moved with a terrifying efficiency. He threw heavy logs onto the embers, blowing on them until the fire roared into life, casting a fierce orange glow across the room. He grabbed the thickest wool blankets he owned, his NYPD football throw, and a heavy flannel sheet. He wrapped the puppy carefully, leaving only its nose exposed, and placed it on the hearth. As the room began to warm, Elias stood by the window, peering into the white hell outside. He knew Luna was out there, bleeding and freezing, running a race against a storm that didn't care about mothers or heroes. He didn't know how many more there were, but he knew he had to be ready. He gathered every towel in the house, stacking them near the fire. He filled a bowl with water and placed it on the stove to warm. He was a policeman again, and his porch was now the thin blue line between life and death. He sat on the floor by the door, his hand resting on a pile of warm blankets, watching the dark woods and waiting for the scratch to return. The grandfather clock in the corner of the living room ticked with a heavy, judgmental cadence, marking the passage of a night that refused to end. Elias Thorne remained anchored to the floorboards near the entrance, his large frame hunched over like a gargoyle watching over a sacred tomb. Every 30 minutes the script of the storm repeated itself with grueling precision. First came the low whine of the wind against the chimney, followed by the frantic, uneven scratching that had become the only signal Elias cared for. Each time he opened the door, a fresh wave of Arctic air threatened to extinguish the hearth, but it also brought a new flicker of life. By the second and third trips, the routine was a blur of adrenaline and heartbreak. Luna would emerge from the white haze, her black and tan fur no longer distinguishable under a thick, crystalline armor of ice. Her movements were becoming mechanical, her legs trembling with a violent neurological fatigue that made Elias's stomach knot in familiar dread. He had seen this kind of shock before in soldiers and street cops, the point where the body stops functioning for itself and begins to operate on pure sacrificial intent. By the fourth and fifth journeys, Luna's breathing had become a series of ragged, wet gasps that Elias could hear even before she reached the porch. Her exhales were frantic plumes of white steam, dissipating instantly in the freezing gale. She was no longer just a dog. She was a vessel of sheer maternal defiance. Elias watched in stunned silence as she deposited the fifth pup, her amber eyes now glazed with a cloudy film of exhaustion. He reached out to steady her, his calloused hand brushing her frozen flank, but she flinched away with a sharp, instinctive focus. She didn't have time for comfort. She didn't have time for him. With a hollow grunt of effort, she pivoted on her bleeding paws and disappeared back into the forest, her tail tucked low against the wind. Elias counted. The tiny bodies huddled near the fire. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each was a miracle wrapped in wool, a tiny heartbeat struggling to find its rhythm in a world that wanted to freeze it solid. During the agonizing intervals when Luna was lost to the storm, Elias found himself thrust into a role he was entirely unprepared for. The cabin, which had served as a mausoleum for his grief for 2 years, was suddenly a nursery of frantic activity. He realized the pups were fading. Their mother's milk was inaccessible, and their body temperatures were fluctuating dangerously. He moved to the kitchen, his boots clattering on the linoleum as he searched through his meager supplies. He found a carton of goat's milk he'd bought from a local farmer and a small plastic dropper meant for oiling his old service weapon. After sterilizing the dropper in boiling water, he knelt by the hearth. One by one, he picked up the pups. They were so small they fit in the hollow of his palm, their skin translucent and warm beneath the matted fur. With a steady hand that had once held a Glock 17 in the heat of a Bronx shootout, he began to mom, carefully dripping warm milk into their tiny, searching mouths. The silence of the cabin was broken not by the storm, but by a sound Elias hadn't heard himself make in years. A voice. "Easy there, little one," he murmured to a particularly restless pup with a white star on its chest. "Drink up. You've got your mother's fire in you. Don't you dare quit now." The words felt heavy and rusted in his throat, but as he continued, the flow became easier. He started telling them stories, meaningless fragments of old cases, descriptions of the skyline he once protected, and promises of a spring they hadn't yet seen. "She's coming back," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She's out there right now, fighting the whole damn world for you. So you stay strong. You hear me? Don't you let her down." This monologue, directed at 6 inches of fur and bone, began to act as a solvent on the icy walls around his own heart. The toxic silence he had cultivated as a shield against his PTSD was being eroded by the necessity of providing comfort to something smaller and more broken than himself. Just as the clock chimed for the 6th time, the scratch returned, but it was lower, a dull thud of a body hitting the wood. Elias lunged for the door. Luna stood there, but she didn't look like an animal anymore. She looked like a casualty. Her coat was a matted mess of blood, ice, and forest debris. On her 6th trip, she had brought a pup that was nearly twice the size of the others, its weight clearly having pushed her past her physical limit. She stumbled across the threshold, her legs buckling as she lowered the pup onto the rug. Elias caught her before her head hit the floor, his strong arms supporting her shivering weight. For the first time, she didn't pull away. She leaned into his gray sweater, her hot, labored breath soaking into the fabric. Elias looked at the 6 puppies now gathered in the glow of the fire, a small army of survivors. He felt a profound, humbling awe at the creature in his arms. She had traveled miles in a lethal blizzard, wounded and starving, to ensure that not a single heartbeat was lost to the cold. In that moment, the former officer felt a spark of the duty he thought he'd lost forever, rekindled by the desperate, beautiful sacrifice of a dog. The warmth of the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating as the clock neared the 4-hour mark since Luna's first arrival. Elias Thorne sat on the floor, his fingers absent-mindedly stroking the velvet ears of the 6 puppies huddled near the hearth, but his Atlantic blue eyes were fixed on the door. He had thought the 6th journey was the end. Luna had collapsed in his arms, her body a map of ice and agony. Yet, less than 20 minutes after she had succumbed to sleep, she had bolted upright, her amber eyes wide with a frantic, primal realization. Before Elias could block the exit, she had slipped past him like a ghost, back into a storm that had grown even more teeth. The wind outside now carried a high-pitched scream, a white-out condition that made it impossible to see the porch railing from the window. Elias paced the small room, his heavy boots echoing like a heartbeat against the timber. He felt the old phantom pains in his shoulder, a psychosomatic remnant of the night Benny died, a warning that the universe was preparing to take something else from him. Then came a sound that didn't resemble a scratch at all. It was a dull, heavy thud against the base of the door, followed by a silence so profound it was terrifying. Elias lunged, throwing the door open. The blizzard didn't just blow in, it invaded. Luna was there, or rather, a heap of black and tan fur buried under a fresh drift. She didn't have the strength to stand. She was lying on her side, her chest barely hitching. Clamped firmly, but with desperate gentleness in her jaws, was the seventh puppy. It was the smallest of the litter, a tiny runt with a coat the color of coal and a singular white patch on its chest. Elias scooped them both up in one massive movement, the 100-pound dog and the ounce-heavy pup, and dragged them into the warmth, kicking the door shut against the howling void. As he laid them on the rug, the horror settled in. The puppy was cold. Not just chilled, but deathly, unnervingly cold. It didn't squirm. It didn't whine. Its tiny mouth was slightly open and its ribs were as still as stone. Luna, whose legs were now useless, began to crawl. She dragged her hindquarters across the wood, leaving a faint trail of melted frost and blood. She reached the tiny, coal-colored pup and began to lick it. Her movements were frantic, her tongue stroking the pup's face with a rhythmic desperation, as if she could lick the life back into its lungs. She looked up at Elias, her amber eyes clouded with a film of exhaustion and a raw, naked plea that shattered the last of his emotional defenses. In that gaze, Elias didn't see an animal. He saw every mother he'd ever had to notify of a tragedy, every partner who had ever looked at him for a miracle he couldn't provide. A cold wave of panic crashed over Elias. His vision blurred, the cabin walls dissolving into the rain-slicked streets of the Bronx. He saw Benny's face, pale and unmoving under the neon lights. He felt the same paralysis, the same crushing weight of being too late. Not again. Please God, not again. The silence of the puppy was a roar in his ears. Suddenly, Elias let out a guttural sound, a shout that remained trapped in his throat, a silent scream of defiance against the reaper. "Not today," he finally hissed, his voice a jagged edge of iron. "I am not letting anyone die today." He shoved the memories aside with a violent act of will. He was no longer a broken man in the woods. He was a first responder at a high-stress scene. He moved the tiny puppy onto the hearth, close enough to the fire to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid the singe. He knelt, his massive frame towering over the creature. Using just the tips of his two fingers, the index and the middle, he placed them over the puppy's ribcage. He began to perform CPR, the compression so delicate he feared he might crush the tiny bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, puff. He leaned down, placing his mouth over the puppy's entire head, exhaling a tiny, controlled puff of warm air into its nostrils and mouth. Luna had stopped licking. She was watching him, her chin resting on the floor, her breathing coming in shallow hitches. She didn't growl. She didn't move. She watched Elias with a profound, terrifying trust, an absolute surrender of her child's life into his calloused hands. "Come on, Scout," Elias whispered, giving the runt a name in the heat of the struggle. "Breathe for me. Breathe for your mother. Look at her. She didn't run through hell for you to stop now." He continued the cycle, the two-finger compressions and the gentle puffs of air, his Atlantic blue eyes never leaving the puppy's chest. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Elias's rhythmic, desperate count. He was fighting for more than a dog. He was fighting for the right to believe he wasn't a failure. He was trying to catch the hand he had let slip 2 years ago, through the medium of this tiny, coal-colored life. The rhythm of the compressions had become a prayer, a desperate physical mantra performed by Elias Thorne's trembling fingers. Outside, the blizzard screamed, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the frantic counting of a man trying to bargain with fate. Realizing he had reached the limit of his field training, Elias reached for his satellite phone with his free hand, dialing the only person who lived close enough to understand the gravity of a life on the line. After 3 agonizing rings, the screen flickered to life, illuminating the rugged, bearded face of the former officer with a cold blue light. On the other end of the video call appeared Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was a woman who seemed built for the harsh Vermont winters. In her late 30s, she was tall and lithe, with a face that managed to be both stern and deeply compassionate. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a messy, practical knot, and her skin was pale save for a few freckles across a nose that had been broken once in an old farm accident. Sarah was a veterinarian known for her no-nonsense attitude. She had grown up on a dairy farm and had seen the brutal cycle of life and death since she was a child. This upbringing had forged a steel-like calm in her, but behind her mist-gray eyes lay a profound empathy for those who struggled to protect the defenseless. "Elias," Sarah said, her voice steadying the panic in the room like an anchor. She saw the scene through his camera: the motionless, coal-colored pup, the collapsed German Shepherd mother, and the haunted look in Elias's Atlantic blue eyes. "I can't get to you. The main road is a river of ice and the snow is over my headlights. You are my hands now. Do you understand?" Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "His heart is too cold to beat on its own," Sarah instructed, her gaze narrowing as she watched his technique. "Keep the compressions going, but we need to raise his core temperature immediately. Go to the bathroom. Get my old hairdryer I left there last summer. Grab that electric heating pad from the closet. Now." Elias moved with the explosive energy of a man on a raid. He set up a triage station on the hearth, the hairdryer humming a low, warm tune as he directed the heat over the tiny black pup, being careful to keep it at a distance so as not to burn the delicate skin. The hour that followed was a grueling dance of domestic improvisation. Under Sarah's watchful eye, Elias used his own body heat, tucking the tiny Scout inside his charcoal gray sweater, pressing the pup's cold chest against his own warm, rhythmic heart. "Talk to him, Elias," Sarah whispered through the speaker. "He needs to hear a reason to stay." Elias, a man who had forgotten how to speak to his own reflection, began to murmur. He told the pup about the smell of the forest after the rain, the taste of a good steak, and the way the sun felt on the porch steps in July. Through the screen, Sarah watched more than just a rescue. She saw the way Elias's hands, scarred from years of duty, cradled the animal with a tenderness that bordered on the holy. She saw the wall he had built around himself after Benny's death beginning to crack, stone by agonizing stone. She realized that Elias wasn't just fighting for a dog, he was fighting for the part of his soul that had died in the Bronx. "He's moving," Elias suddenly gasped. The tiny, coal-colored puppy had given a microscopic twitch. Then a sound emerged, a high-pitched, fragile squeak that was more a sigh than a bark. Its chest gave a sudden, jagged heave and then settled into a shallow but steady rise and fall. Elias felt a jolt of electricity run through his spine. He looked at Luna. The 5-year-old German Shepherd, who had been watching the entire ordeal with her chin resting on the floor, let out a deep, shuddering sigh of her own. For the first time that night, the amber light in her eyes softened. She leaned forward, resting her heavy, tired head on Elias's thigh, her tail giving one weak, grateful thump against the wood before her eyes finally drifted shut in a deep, earned sleep. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the toxic, heavy silence of grief, but the peaceful stillness of a battle won. Sarah, still on the screen, watched Elias as he sat there, covered in dog hair, soot, and sweat, holding the breathing pup against his chest while the mother dog slept on his leg. Her mist-gray eyes grew misty. "Elias," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely showed. "Look at them. You did it. You did the thing you thought you'd never be able to do again." Elias looked up, his face illuminated by the dying fire. "You brought them home, Elias. Every single one of them. They're safe because you didn't let go." The weight of her words, the realization that he had finally succeeded in a rescue, hit Elias like a physical blow. The dam inside him finally broke. Tears, hot and silent at first, then, racking his broad shoulders, began to flow. He pressed his face into his hand, sobbing for the partner he couldn't save, for the years he had spent in the dark, and for the tiny, warm heartbeat currently thumping against his ribs. It was the sound of a man being found after 2 years of being lost. The harsh, jagged edges of winter finally surrendered to the persistent warmth of the Hudson Valley spring. In the mountains surrounding Willow Creek, the oppressive white silence had been replaced by a chaotic, joyful symphony of rushing meltwater and the song of returning thrushes. Elias Thorne stood on his porch, but he was no longer the man who lived like a ghost. The timber of the cabin seemed to glow under the amber April sun, and the air smelled of wet earth and budding hemlock. Below him, the yard was a whirlwind of activity. 6 of the puppies, now robust and leggy teenagers with the classic confidence of their German Shepherd lineage, were spending their final afternoon together. They tumbled over one another, their barks ringing out clear and sharp, echoing off the valley walls. Elias watched them with a steady, peaceful gaze. These were no longer the frozen bundles of fur he had fought to revive. They were living testaments to a night where death had lost its grip. One by one. Over the past week, the families had arrived. Elias had been meticulous, vetting each one with the scrutiny of a veteran investigator. The 4th pup went to a young couple from the village, while the others were adopted by fellow officers from the nearby precincts, men and women who understood the bond between a human and a shepherd. As the last of the 6 was loaded into a car, Elias felt a twinge of sadness, but it was quickly eclipsed by a profound sense of completion. He turned his attention to the 2 who remained. Grace, formerly known as Scout, was the miracle of the litter. Though she was slightly smaller than her siblings, she possessed a fierce, intelligent spark in her coal-black eyes and a singular white patch on her chest that looked like a star. She sat perfectly at Elias's heel, her ears pricked, watching the world with a calm that mirrored her mother's. Luna lay nearby on a patch of new grass, the sun warming her black and tan coat, which was now thick, glossy, and free of ice. The jagged tear in her ear had healed into a small notch, a badge of honor, and her amber eyes were clear, no longer clouded by terror but reflecting a deep, settled contentment. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the matriarch of this new life Elias had built. Elias reached down, his calloused hand, now steady and sure, stroking the velvet of her head. He had made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. Luna and Grace would stay. They were the ones who had found him in the dark, and he would be the one to keep them in the light. The shift in Elias's soul was reflected in his professional life as well. He had recently taken down the heavy curtains that once kept the world out, and on his desk lay a new set of documents. He wasn't returning to the NYPD patrols or the sirens of the Bronx. Instead, he had accepted a position as the lead trainer for the Regional Search and Rescue, SAR K9 unit. He realized that his decades of tactical experience and his newfound connection to these animals could be fused into a single purpose: finding those who were lost. He was no longer a man defined by the hand he let go, but by the lives he was now trained to pull back from the edge. As the sun began its slow descent toward the ridgeline, a familiar green Jeep pulled into the dirt driveway. Sarah Mitchell stepped out, looking refreshed in a forest green jacket and hiking boots, her auburn hair swaying in the breeze. She carried a small bag of treats and a camera. Over the past few months, the professional bond formed during that harrowing video call had blossomed into a deep, quiet friendship, rooted in mutual respect and the shared memory of a miracle. "Ready for the sunset hike?" she asked, her mist-gray eyes brightening as Grace bounded over to greet her. Elias smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his Atlantic blue eyes. "We've been waiting for you," he replied. They walked together toward the upper meadow, a vast expanse of gold and purple wildflowers that danced in the evening wind. Luna ran ahead, her gait smooth and powerful, leaping over fallen logs as if the trauma of the blizzard had been nothing but a dream. Elias watched her, marveling at her resilience. He stopped at the highest point of the meadow, looking up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to peek through the twilight. For the first time in 2 years, the image of Benny didn't bring a sharp stab of pain. Instead, he felt a warmth, as if his old partner was looking down, finally seeing Elias at peace. He reached into his pocket and felt the cool metal of his old badge, then looked at the 2 shepherds and the woman standing beside him. He realized that the badge was just metal. The true authority of a protector came from the heart's capacity to heal. "You were right, Sarah," Elias said softly, his voice steady. "I thought I needed a wall to survive. I just needed to open the door." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, nodding slowly. Luna came back to them, sitting between Elias and Grace, her amber eyes reflecting the fading sun. Elias looked out over the mountains he once thought would be his graveyard, but which had become his sanctuary. He knew now that Grace wasn't just the name of a dog, it was the gift he had been given. He was a protector again, not of laws and perimeters, but of hope and second chances. As they turned to walk back toward the glowing lights of the cabin, Elias Thorne finally felt like he was home.